Roundtable number 4 with AXEGENAI. Thank you all for joining. I've put together a presentation for you today, and we will continue with conversations that we've been having for the last 4 weeks. So, this is the fourth week of this discussion where we are hovering over the financial information that we need in order to capture the best return on our investment. Um, the the conversation that we've had so far is focused on this idea that if you have a use case and you want to deliver that use case successfully, the measure of success is your financial output, as in return on investment, right? The model works perfectly fine. The users love it, and the model has very little financial incentive for your enterprise. Um, could be a problematic statement, as in it has to work somewhere, right? It has to have a clear productivity gain and upfront bottom line, right? So, excuse me, improved bottom line. And speaking of this large language model that is really in front of everybody's attention at this point, that I always joke about this, but it is true that we forgot about AI. We're just focusing on ChatGPT, and it's because I'm not sure what the percentage is, but as far as a majority of the folks that I've spoken to, they see ChatGPT as an AI. But there's many layers of AI. ChatGPT is just one of them. ChatGPT is one that is a successful use case. And to go back to my original point about uh, having ChatGPT be financially viable as a product is is sort of questionable, right? As because it is very expensive and it is one of a kind expensive tool that is available right now for audience and publics to use. However, the cost of that operation for ChatGPT as an open AI to provide that service through Microsoft um, there's a lot of these hidden questions that we don't know much about. Like, how do they stay viable? What are their operation costs like, and how do they make it work? Right. The assumption that I have is that they are well funded to a point that once they get to the point of being viable, they'll prove themselves worth it. At this point, it's all uh, get in front of the customers and have more subscriptions and have more APIs that is being sold as a service, right? For a large scale enterprise like OpenAI, and for Microsoft to partner with OpenAI to provide the service, I think financially it just makes sense, be it that it will work out eventually. For many enterprises, that's not the case because the enterprises have to rely on um, capabilities that either comes from ChatGPT or other sources. And once it does come from other sources, once you onboard it in your enterprise, um, how do you make it worth your time? As in your human capital that goes into it, how does it improve your business process? How do you capture that business process as a justified investment, right? How do you justify that investment for not today or next week or next month, but the full life cycle of it, right? As long as you're using it. That's important because these services are not that cheap. And being expensive means they can go out of control, right? One quick example that I can discuss is that some company put a cap on how much of their large language model API should be able to charge. So there's a cap, and that cap runs out within few days or few hours because of some sort of a R&D process that was taking place, and for somebody to explore how that R&D will have an output. By the time that output was given, they already ran out of that funding, right? Or ran out of that subscription for that month, right? So the strategy is just a common sense here, right? Strategy is a common sense to look at the full life cycle, to understand all this cost that is associated with a large language model. It, it's common sense in the sense that you've already been through it. You've already seen the cloud. If you're familiar with cloud system and how you have to interact with the cloud, how you upscaled and downscaled, and what are sort of the engagement that you had in cloud, how did you keep an eye on it, monitored it? It's a common sense actually with a large language model as well. You really have to think of it as in it's a cloud service and not necessarily line by line or everything like similar to cloud, but it has some significant differences that I would like to discuss at the end of this presentation. The idea behind this presentation is to have you start thinking, right? Not necessarily on a use case, but how do you use a large language model, or if necessary, a Gen AI for that particular use case? So my assumption, again, is to think that you already have a use case in mind. And that use case, how do you make it efficient with the large language model, right? So if your use case is not all large language model, but it's a high level AI, and then you want to be able to have a large language model as part of the use case to interact with that large language, not a large language model, but the AI system. How do you implement that large language model? And the reason that's important is because if your large language model costs more than the AI system itself, because now you're running into the budget that you have for AI. Maybe you don't need large language model, you just have an AI system that you are engaging with. And now we have the gentleman of the hour joining us. Naz, how you doing?
Doing well, doing well. My apologies. I have been running into some technical issues to start this, and I had to do a reboot.
Well, technical folks having technical issues is
There
the
you
best way to learn new things.
go. Yes, when they say technology will fail, it does occur. So glad to be here.
Yes, glad to have you, sir, because this is our roundtable discussion number 4, and we're continuing with the theme, of course. And like we talked about large language model. Look, I think we talked about MLOps. We've spoken about cost of MLOps. But to dive into something specific inside of MLOps is a very difficult task, as in which part of MLOps do you pick? Which use case do you pick, right? But to have a large language model as a frame to understand the large MLOps cost, I think is a good start. So today's discussion is all about large language model, right? To understand, if you understand the large language model cost, now you see the big picture, as in the rest of your AI will probably cost more than that large language model, right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I this is coming right into that topic. I think if you take a little bit of step back to make sure there's a structured approach to this following thought process, to your question about cost for large language model. Number one is, again, I mean, as we discussed pre-recording earlier today or yesterday, there's a what I call due diligence that has to occur to get to the point of which is the right model to use. For any cost or budgeting allocation, like you got to start with some of the key, what I call, stages that you have to go through. I mean, to me as a consultant, we ran through those exercises multiple times, right? It's assessment and planning, and then cost allocation, and then ROI analysis, and then funding strategies and risk mitigation, and then the monitoring and adjustments and all that good stuff that goes along with it. But these are actually critical. One of the key thing that I noticed, to your point, and this is where it comes in, is you've got the data, you're doing all that stuff. It's really the analysis piece, right? Is when you start doing the cost estimate, as a human factor, you probably have limited knowledge. And then I'm saying that in the context of machine learning versus human knowledge. So what you can do is, you can plan that, hey, in my instantiation of large language model or building AI platform, I am going to use XYZ, but you won't see the cost until you hit the, hey, go do this act. And then you all of a sudden is like, oh, what the heck? I've got this X amount of dollars that I'm going to pay now.
Yeah.
And for that matter, I don't know if your listeners have heard of this thing called frugal GPT, right? So the idea is that you actually let the frugal GPT orchestrate that when you actually do your instantiation of prompts. So it works like, you basically, what you do is you query large language module through APIs, but you first basically what you do is you go into Frugal GPT, you write your prompt, and then it runs APIs against different models to see which one are most cost effective.
Yeah.
And then it gives you, and it actually in most cases, it enhances results as well as the outcome. So if you take that for a context, then then really becomes, okay, now I have a tool that does it automatically for you. How do I structure this right? So that, in my environment, when I'm instantiating large language models or I'm building AI platform services, how do I make sure that this particular aspect is embedded into it? And that is where, people like us, as we mentioned about AXEGENAI, comes into play. Is, all right, we can help you define that. We can help you understand where to put these sort of what I call the checkpoints, the gate checks, to say, is this cost optimized? Is this operational optimize, or operational excellence is in there too? Because, as I said, Frugal GPT is one example, but that's how you would want to see is, hey, if I want to control the cost and here's what I'm building, this is the right model that's going to go give me the best outcome and efficiency.
Let's put some numbers into what Frugal GPT and this flow of APIs that you have to understand. And I think I'll throw in a number here. It's $30 versus 6 cents. That's the sort of distances in prices that we're talking about in the spectrum. It could cost you 6 cents, or it could cost you $30. And that's just for inference, not even for the output yet, right? So 36 cents. Which one do you think will be more cost efficient, right? But now, another piece of that is, if I was to say, my name is Joe Schmo, that's 6 cents. But if I was to say, what's 30 multiplied by 8.56 million, that's $30 worth of inference, right? There's the gap in what it is that you're processing, right? And beyond Frugal GPT, there's a Microsoft product that will actually understand your token in a sense that it will delete all the other tokens that is not necessary for a system to process. Yeah. So Microsoft product will be able to give you the token that you've written and the tokens that is actually needed, and create, and I'll give you another spectrum here. It takes 30,000 tokens and turns it into thousands. And that's important, because when you measure a token, you can measure a token and say, like, well, token is a word. Well, not necessarily, because a single word can have multiple tokens in it. So when you look at 30, let's call it 100 words, that is not necessarily 100 token. That's more than 100 token, actually, right? So when you're looking at it from these perspectives, you really have to start thinking, okay, my use case is not necessarily for a chatbot in my website. It's actually for me to calculate a sort of like a cost analysis, cost benefit analysis, or return on investment analysis. It has a lot of numbering in it. Cost difference for that is different than a chatbot that is simply answering questions like, who are you? Tell me your name. Where can I find this business? And how much does this business cost? As in, you're running a store and the customer is asking you for the product information, right? So the product information is like, this bottle here costs 30 cents, right? That's the kind of information that ChatGPT is providing. Not necessarily ChatGPT, any large language model. So these interaction, if you are to look at it from multiple perspectives, the cost goes up in one sense, but you can also decrease that cost if you are approaching this very smartly. So I think you're right on the point, Nas, that we really have to do our due diligence, right? We have to do our due diligence, because yes, you can learn from other people's mistake, or you can make that mistake yourself and learn from it as well, right? I think you call it a genius versus wisdom, right?
That's right.
There's a genius out there that learn from their own mistake, but the wise people are the one that learns from other people's mistake.
Yeah.
So in that analogy, I think everything you see here in table of content, I can walk them step by step, but I don't think that's necessary, because from this conversation, a third assumption I have is that after you listen to us, you probably will do a deep dive and understand more of these topics from your own research. And there's as many information as you need in order to do a large language model. And I think one comparison that I was making earlier, that between cloud implementation and large language model implementation, there are some familiarity. But the difference between cloud and large language model is that you have all the access of information that you need on tip of your finger for free. Whereas in cloud, you really have to dive deep and get the technical information and put all sorts of information together for yourself. Whereas for AI and large language models specifically, I think the information is very widely available and easier to understand.
Yeah. Good points, Asif. And I want to kind of echo some of the sort of the build, or rather build on top of what you mentioned. In terms of the cost estimation for AI deployments using large language model, there's different variables that listeners of your podcast or users or the enterprises have to take into account. It is a multi-pronged approach, right? Within cost estimate alone, you have different variables like cost of acquisition in terms of product or technologies, and then you have integration costs, you have deployment costs, you have there's sort of like a lot of the nuances within when you actually do cost estimation. There's direct costs and indirect costs as well. And then if you take that further to do ROI analysis, you also have certain estimations in that ROI analysis. There's some tangibles and non-tangible. Non-tangible being customer experience and user experience, right? So it's like it's such a sort of a what I call intricate process where a proper due diligence is needed. And here's the other thing: the key metrics continue to evolve over time. When I started out with LLM, they talked about it, for ChatGPT 3.5 or 3.0 was that 15 liters of water, is equal of one prompt, right? Or one prompt equal 15 liters of water. The result that you run or it runs. Now you take the fast forward, ChatGPT 4 does it for 4 cents, right? Today, same ChatGPT 3 or 3.5 will do it for a third of a cent, or ChatGPT will do it 4 cents. So now you take that further, right, in terms of like the output that it's doing or it's producing. You have hallucinations in there too. Now you factor in all the other nuances to get the operational excellence. Now the cost can quadruple easily, right? And hence, when I mentioned to your product, there's a product of Microsoft, but then if you put Frugal GPT in the middle, you can orchestrate where it can tell you how to do it without a human in the loop. It says this is more efficient for you to run. But there's a fine balance here. The balance is, although, on the traditional readings, Frugal GPT does enhancements of certain tasks, or most of the tasks they did ask, by actually reducing the cost of the overall consumption. But there's a fine line between the operational, the outcome that you would get, and the cost that you would bear for that outcome, right? It's an intricate balance. So obviously, the more accurate when you start putting in likes of Chat GPT, and then you have RAG models, and you have llamas in there to bring in real world sort of real time information. Then the cost will go up, right? So it's a fine balance. It's finding that balance is what necessitates where you put in due diligence to build the right architecture to ensure that you have not only cost optimization but also the operational excellence.
Let's create a bridge from earlier discussions we had between roundtable discussion 1 and 2, right? We talked about upskilling. This is the sort of benefit of upskilling your own business process owners, as in your current workforce that is very well versed in your business process and your business needs, right? Because you can go after fine tuning or parameter efficient fine tuning. Whichever you approach, you have different cost, right? The fine tuning actually gets some hefty cost behind it, where parameter efficient fine tuning will keep the cost down, and it will actually make it work depending on your business use case. Like, how sensitive is that information to you, right? And you have, let me go to the next slide here. So you have your own ability to build it in-house, maybe in your basement, or you can do APIs. And I think to go back to Nazim's point here, if your workforce is educated enough, they're upskilled to the point that they're able to say, I know my business need very well, that if a system was to run like a human without the human in the loop, the system will automatically pick this text with this many token. We only need this much token, run that and come back with the output. Okay, great. But there's another one that same Frugal GPT will say, well, this question should not even go to the cheapest one. Let's say, for example, you have a Mistral versus Chat GPT. Mistral costs very little, very popular. But Mistral is probably not the best one for this sort of answers. Like going back to the point earlier about multiply 30 by 8.5 million, something, right? A good calculation that a ChatGPT can do. Oh, there's the other option as well. You don't have just Mistral and ChatGPT. You have, I think, close to 10 other products in between, right? So the Frugal GPT will be able to indicate that, hey, as soon as you give me a prompt, not only do I tokenize it correctly, I also give you the right output for the right efficient cost. So there's a difference between you relying on a vendor, just a single vendor, versus a vendor that will actually use multiple vendors, right? I think there's these infrastructure that you are able to set up similar to how you used to set up cloud, as in, downscale and upscale. If you don't need it, don't use it. If you need it, ramp it up, right? But have early detection systems put in place so that way, when you need it, it's automatically available for you, right? Sort of that elastic understanding of cloud. And you being the cloud guru, I think you can appreciate that. So, and going back to the same cloud theory all over again, right? Where are you deploying this to? Are you deploying this from scratch, spending millions of dollars, struggling with understanding where your GPU services will come from and what sort of parameters you will have? Because there's a difference between 11, 13, and 75. And 11 being 11 billion, 13 billion, and 75 billion, right? There's a huge difference. There's gaps in between. And do you really need that? What sort of large language model do you want to develop from scratch, or do you just want to use one and say, let me sample that one and make it mine, right? As in personalize it and adopt it for your business use case. And of course, that's all we're talking about, is the fact that if you have a use case and you would like to utilize large language model for that use case, not necessarily a large language model is the use case. What I mean by that is that you have an AI use case, but you want to insert a large language model into it, right? So you want to create an agent AI, and you want to have that agent AI have a large language model capability, so that way you are able to interact with that agent AI, right? If you have a full scope AI that costs a few $100,000 or $few million, how much of it is a large language model, right? Because think about it from deploying a fact that like this AI belongs to you, yet this large language model comes from an API, right? As in from outside of the house. How do you interact with it? How do you maintain it? How do you keep the cost down so that way the AI that you're building in-house is not only is it worth deploying, it's also financially viable, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely a great point. And going back to your point about, again, the cloud versus on-prem. I think the cloud vendors in today's day and age have matured over time, and I think it's beneficial for enterprises, since we're talking about budget, right, or financing. It would be counterproductive, if I could use that term here, to just do it on your own, because these vendors have service credits. You can go to AWS. They have certain options there. They provide you service credits. They have something. If you go through the APN, which is their AWS partner network, you get certain promotions and some certain funding pools that's available. It's a shared pool. But then if you go to Azure, they provide Azure credits, right, through their programs like Azure Startups, similar to Google does. So it's important to understand these nuances before you decide, hey, I want to do it either on-prem or on cloud. I think the fundamental, again, if you do it on the cloud, it's again, you have those funding options available to offset some of your costs. But the scalability, right, is you won't get that no matter what you say today. I mean, perhaps it's my own lack of understanding, but within the on-prem model, you don't have that consumption-based model, right? They can tag it XYZ, but then there are other variables that are attached to it that gives you the static, that you have to pay for that static cost, which you're not even using, but you're paying for it, versus going, the cloud model where, it's purely, what you use. So over time, things might change, but today that is the case. And to your listeners, especially the enterprises, when you talk about, doing it on-prem versus cloud, I would certainly go with the cloud option because of what I had mentioned earlier in terms of offsetting your CapEx.
And to continue with that, I think the innovation that's coming down the pipeline is that the small models that are far more efficient and effective. And continuing with the theme, Microsoft is working towards a large language model that is small enough but yet still effective, right? But then again, do you need a small model or do you actually need a complicated model, right? You really have to do your due diligence, like as we mentioned in the beginning of the conversation. But in our last roundtable discussion, we talked about the fact that there was cybersecurity aspects. So when you jump into the use case and get very excited, you really have to keep the cybersecurity concerns in mind as well. Just like I mentioned on the last roundtable discussions, that there could be poisoning of this data. There could be poisoning of the large language model as well. There could be some sabotage that could happen. Now, those are the full ecosystem that you really have to be concerned with. So when you say due diligence in cost, due diligence in security, due diligence in your scalability, due diligence in your sustainability, right? So some of the things that are happening right now, and the reason I mentioned small model earlier, is that small models cost less, but they're also less energy consuming. So you keep that in mind as well, is that these systems, they cost you penny, but they also cost the energy sector a lot of the energy as well. So more you're able to quantize and prune your use cases, as in you're correctly using prompt engineering to reduce the energy cost. So you're really covering the full ecosystem, right? You're keeping your own costs down, but you're also using less energy. And as the system gets smaller and smaller, instead of you targeting ChatGPT continuously because you have infinite amount of income or wealth or the bank balance, you are actually considering these little other options to make, say, like, I don't need this ChatGPT all the time that costs $30 and costs this many gigawatts, which is about equivalent to a few thousand houses, right? To just create my large language model use case, right? So you're being innovative, you're being engaging, and your workforce is energized with this new enablement, right? With this new information and this new engagement, with this sort of efficient innovation. So I think it's a win-win for all around if we are knowledgeable, if we are upskilled on this topic, and we have the ability to, again, navigating the future of LLM cost, right? We are ready for it, but we're before we jump into the pool, we learn how to swim and we get all the proper gears that we need before we jump in.
Yeah, no, absolutely great points. I think you summed it all pretty well. This is something I'm learning from you as well. So no, these are absolutely great points.
Yeah, so I think that's all I had for today, because I created this slide so that way if you're listening to this video pre-recorded, you should be able to look through the slides and say what do the slides have, not just my words in it, right? Because what we would like you to do is actually go learn these topics for your use case and educate yourself, not only on the excitement part of large language model, but how do you sustain and scale over time? Because any large language model you develop today, you would want it to have a future use case that is not framed only for the current use case. And that's the goal right here.
Yep.
So with that being said, we will meet next week again on roundtable discussion number 5. Any departing thoughts?
No, I think this is a great topic. I just again, when it comes to costing and budgeting, it's a very it's sensitive as well, because obviously it's got a lot of implications to the overarching enterprise models. But it's a necessary thing that must be done. And my parting thoughts is as an enterprise, you're not alone. That's number one. Second, the more you learn, the better you are, which is obviously universal knowledge.
Right.
I would say, if you're looking at leveraging a cloud vendor, explore the funding options with them. There's a lot of ways to offset the cost. You don't have to your point, empty out your bank accounts. There's ways to offset the cost. There's programs out there. You just got to know which one they are that are the right fit for you and the categories that you can leverage under. The rest is really easy. And again, the technology will continue to evolve and changes will continue to happen. But the cost is obviously for everything that you do, there's a cost associated with it. And figuring out a way to evolve over time and be innovative in your cost strategies will pay dividends.
Well, Naz, thank you so much for joining, brother. We'll see you next week. And until then, everybody take care.
Pleasure to be here.